Kansas, summer of 1966. Garden City, a quiet agricultural town. No skyscrapers, no gangs, no constant police sirens, just grain elevators, cattle trucks, and endless flatland. Now imagine this town waking up after the worst flood it had seen in decades. The Arkansas River had overflowed its banks. Fields were underwater, roads collapsed, basements filled with mud. When the water finally began to retreat, it didn't come back empty. At 7:42 a.m., a local farm worker named Curtis Heller was checking damage along the eastern riverbank. What he noticed first wasn't the sight, it was the smell. Later, he would describe it as sweet, metallic, and rotten at the same time. Curtis walked closer and saw a burlap sack stuck in the mud. Heavy, swollen, tied with thick rope. At first, he thought it was farm waste or animal remains. He pulled out a knife and cut it open. What fell out changed this town forever. Not a body bones, human bones. A skull with a fractured side, parts of a rib cage, a leg bone, yellowed, partially burned, and unnaturally clean in certain places. By 8:15 a.m., the Finney County Sheriff's Department was on scene. Sheriff Thomas Ridgway, a 52-year-old lawman with almost 30 years of experience, arrived and immediately understood this wasn't an accident. Someone had packed these remains, someone had weighted the sack, someone had chosen the river, and someone had believed they would never be found. The area was sealed off and state investigators were called in. Within hours, forensic specialists made a discovery that pushed this case from disturbing to terrifying. The bones showed signs of extreme heat exposure, not wildfire damage, not trash burning, but industrial-level heat. When investigators used the words cremation furnace, the room went silent. Because Garden City had only one cremation facility at the time, Dry Hollow Memorial Funeral Home. Think about what that means. Whoever did this had access to professional funeral equipment, access to chemicals, and access to bodies. Not a drifter, not a random criminal, but someone trusted, someone inside the system. And here is where the story gets darker. When Sheriff Ridgway started reviewing death records from the past 7 years, patterns began to appear. Elderly men found dead in isolated homes. Seasonal workers who vanished without official missing person reports. A homeless veteran listed as a heart failure case. Migrant laborers recorded as unidentified remains. At the time, nobody connected these cases. Small towns don't look for monsters, they look for explanations. Accidents, illness, bad luck. But now, the river forced Garden City to look backward, and what they were about to see was not coincidence. Now let's shift across town. Same evening. Dry Hollow Memorial Funeral Home. From the outside, the building looked peaceful. Clean white walls, quiet parking lot. Soft lights meant to comfort grieving families. Inside, Everett Calderón stood at a stainless steel sink washing his hands. Not because they were dirty, but because routine mattered to him. Everett was 38 years old, a former Army medic and Korean War veteran. Quiet, controlled, emotionally distant. In Garden City, he was known as professional and reliable, the kind of man people trusted with their dead relatives. Behind him, the cremation chamber was still warm. A small radio on the wall was quietly reporting flood damage updates. No mention yet of the river discovery, but Everett already felt that something was wrong. His wife, Marlene Calderón, stood in the office doorway holding accounting ledgers. She didn't rush and she didn't panic. She simply said, "They found something at the river." Everett froze for half a second. "How serious?" he asked. "State vehicles, multiple units, sheriff cars," she replied. There was silence, not fear, calculation. Everett turned toward her. "We planned for mistakes," he said calmly. "We didn't plan for water." Marlene stepped closer and lowered her voice. "The river doesn't forget. What makes this especially disturbing is the role Dry Hollow Memorial played. It wasn't just a funeral home. It was the final stop. If evidence passed through those doors, it usually never came back out, which made it the perfect place to hide something or someone." Everett looked back at the cremation chamber, then at Marlene. "They won't suspect us first," he said. "We handle grief, we handle death. People trust us." Marlene's expression stayed neutral. "And if they do?" she asked. Everett answered without hesitation. "Then we redirect them." Later that night, Sheriff Ridgway drove past Dry Hollow Memorial on his way home. He slowed down, not because he had evidence and not because he had proof, but because something about the building felt wrong to him. It was dark, quiet, and empty. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He kept driving. And that single decision allowed the killers inside to remain free for months longer. Because what Ridgway didn't know yet was that the bones pulled from the river belonged to only one victim. There were more, hidden in paperwork, hidden in furnaces, hidden inside the town's own death system. And the people responsible weren't running. They were still working, still shaking hands with grieving families, still smiling, still killing. Before we talk about the first murder, we need to understand who Everett and Marlene Calderón really were, because people like this never look dangerous at first glance. They look like neighbors you wave to in the morning, co-workers you share coffee with, or the quiet married couple sitting in the back row of church every Sunday. Everett Calderón arrived in Garden City in 1957, not as a stranger with a dark reputation, but as a war veteran looking for stability. He grew up in southern Colorado in a working-class household with Mexican and Spanish roots, raised by a father who believed emotions were weakness and discipline was survival. When Everett was 14, his mother died suddenly, and 2 years later, he left home and enlisted in the Army, not out of patriotism, but because it was the fastest way to escape a life that already felt empty. Korea changed him permanently. As an Army medic, Everett was surrounded by blood, broken bodies, and constant emergency situations, where every decision had consequences. He learned how fast the human body shuts down when oxygen is restricted, how certain medications slow the heart without stopping it immediately, and how small dosage changes can mean the difference between survival and death. He also learned something far more dangerous, which was that death was not chaotic or mysterious, but mechanical and predictable when you understood the system. When Everett returned to the United States in 1955, he didn't come back violent or unstable. He came back quiet, controlled, and emotionally distant. He avoided crowds, avoided emotional conversations, and avoided anything that reminded him of chaos. What he wanted was structure, routine, and a job where death made sense in an organized professional way, which is exactly how he ended up working at Dry Hollow Memorial Funeral Home. Marlene Krause came from a very different background, but she shared Everett's hunger for control and stability. Born in Nebraska to German immigrant parents, she was raised with strict discipline and a strong belief that reputation and financial security mattered more than personal feelings. She learned bookkeeping, accounting, and business management, moving between small companies until Dry Hollow Memorial hired her to manage contracts, insurance claims, and financial records. That is where Everett and Marlene met, and their relationship did not start with romance or emotional connection. It started with quiet conversations, shared work routines, and mutual respect for efficiency and order. They married in 1958, believing that together they could build something stable and permanent. What they didn't expect was how quickly that stability would begin to collapse. Funeral homes look profitable from the outside, but in small towns they often struggle. Equipment maintenance was expensive, fuel for the cremation furnace kept rising, and many families delayed payments or negotiated lower costs. By early 1959, Everett and Marlene were drowning in debt, struggling with medical bills from Everett's war injury, facing pressure from the bank, and spending nights calculating losses that kept growing instead of shrinking. It was during one of these late nights that Marlene noticed something that most people would never pay attention to, which was how many deaths passed through their system with almost no oversight. Unclaimed bodies, migrant workers without families, elderly men who lived alone, veterans with no next of kin, all of them processed quickly with minimal documentation and very little follow-up. That's when Marlene said something that at first sounded cold, but logical within their situation. She pointed at the ledger and said that these people disappear anyway. and no one checks what happens to them after the paperwork is done. Everett didn't respond immediately, but the idea stayed in his mind, growing stronger every time he handled medication, every time he prepared bodies, and every time he watched how easily paperwork erased questions. Weeks later, the plan finally formed. Everett had access to medical supplies and understood dosage control. Marlene controlled the records and payments, and together they controlled the final stage, the cremation furnace, which destroyed physical evidence permanently. They realized they didn't need violence or chaos, they needed selection, timing, and procedure. Their first target was chosen based on risk, not emotion. His name was Walter Briggs, a 59-year-old former farmhand who drank heavily and lived alone outside town. He had no close family, no regular doctor, and no social connections that would trigger concern if he suddenly died. Everett had treated him once before and already knew his habits and health history. On November 14, 1959, Everett visited Walter under the excuse of checking on an old injury and brought medication mixed carefully with alcohol. Not enough to raise immediate suspicion, but enough to suppress breathing and slow the heart. Walter was found dead the next morning, and the cause was listed as heart failure, with no autopsy ordered and no investigation opened. The body went directly to Dry Hollow Memorial. Everett handled the cremation himself, while Marlene processed the paperwork, and within hours, the physical evidence was gone. What shocked them most was not the success of the crime, but how normal everything felt afterward. There were no police visits, no rumors, no consequences, just silence and routine, which made the act feel less like murder and more like a system exploit. That night, they didn't celebrate, but something changed between them. They understood that the line had been crossed and that going back to normal life was no longer possible. They also started keeping items from victims, not for profit, but for control. Wallets, watches, letters, and identification cards were stored and cataloged by Marlene in a private ledger that recorded names, dates, methods, and outcomes, creating a secret archive that existed parallel to official records. Over the next 2 years, they refined their process, experimenting with different methods that mimicked natural causes such as food poisoning, prescription overdoses, and gas exposure staged as faulty heaters. They spaced the killings carefully, never repeating the same method twice in a row, and never targeting similar victims back to back, while also studying police response times and county reporting delays. This was not impulsive violence. It was organized, calculated, and systematic, and it worked, until they made one critical mistake. They chose a victim who was not invisible, not isolated, and not easy to erase. A woman with connections and a personal paper trail that would later become the first crack in their operation. At the time, Everett and Marlene believed they were untouchable, protected by routine, paperwork, and public trust, unaware that one of their earliest victims would eventually resurface years later through floodwater and broken silt. The river was already moving, and it was carrying their secret back. To truly understand Everett and Marlene Calderón, you need to see the moment when theory became action. Before this, all their plotting, planning, and quiet observation were just exercises, a way to imagine control. But in November 1959, their first real target would become the moment they stepped fully into the world of deliberate murder. A step that would change both of them forever and set a pattern that would haunt Garden City for years. The target was Walter Briggs, 59, a former farmhand who drank too much and lived alone in a small shack on the outskirts of town. He had no close family, no friends who checked in regularly, and no one who could raise alarm if he disappeared. In the eyes of Everett and Marlene, he was the perfect candidate, unremarkable, invisible, easily removed. In smaller towns like Garden City, people who were invisible to society were also invisible to law enforcement, a fact the couple recognized immediately and would exploit with precision. Everett knew Walter from a prior minor injury he had treated. He understood his medical history, his habits, and the way his body responded to medication. This knowledge, acquired through professional trust, would become the weapon of choice. That morning, Everett arrived at Walter's shack, carrying a small bag with a few pills, a bottle of brandy, and a notebook of dosages he had carefully calculated. Marlene stayed home, but in her mind, she had already mapped out the aftermath, the paperwork, the death certificate, the cremation schedule. They were a team, and in this first operation, their synchronization was crucial. Everett knocked, Walter opened the door, blinking in the faint morning light, probably wondering why someone had come to check on him so early. Everett greeted him warmly, offering tea and small talk, easing the tension that might have aroused suspicion. In his bag, hidden beneath a cloth, lay the mixture he had prepared, a combination of prescription medication and alcohol, designed to suppress breathing slowly and quietly, leaving no obvious cause of death. Everett's hands were steady, his voice calm, his presence unthreatening. This was essential. The act had to feel like normalcy. Walter, trusting the man who had helped him before, accepted the tea and medicine without hesitation, never imagining he was ingesting a carefully calculated lethal dose. By mid-afternoon, Walter was found dead in his chair. The coroner, noting his history of heart problems and heavy drinking, listed the cause as heart failure. No autopsy was ordered, no investigation initiated, and the case closed quietly, almost invisibly. Walter's body was transported to Dry Hollow Memorial, where Everett personally supervised the cremation, ensuring that no physical evidence could survive. Marlene processed the paperwork as though this were any other death. The ledger filled out with care, signatures checked, schedules confirmed. Every step was deliberate, precise, and designed to erase the traces of what had truly happened. For Everett and Marlene, the success of this first operation had an unexpected effect. They realized how simple it was to bypass oversight, to exploit societal blind spots, and to use their positions of trust to manipulate outcomes. There were no alarms, no whispered suspicions, no follow-ups from authorities. In that silence, they recognized the power they now held over life and death. It was intoxicating, but not in a chaotic or emotional sense. Their pleasure came from control, from knowing that a single act could be orchestrated from start to finish, executed without detection, and erased entirely from the official record. After the cremation, Marlene recorded in her private ledger the details that would never appear in public documents. Walter Briggs, age 59, date of death, method of administration, and small items taken from his shack. An old watch, a wallet, a folded letter. These items were not stolen for profit, but cataloged as proof of control, a record of the first successful step into their new lives. For them, Walter was not just a victim. He was a benchmark, a measure of their capability to operate undetected. In the weeks following Walter's death, Everett and Marlene began observing patterns of vulnerability among the town's residents. Elderly men living alone, migrant workers, seasonal laborers, and anyone else whose absence would go unnoticed became potential candidates. They refined their techniques, testing small variations in dosage, observing how minor manipulations could simulate natural causes, and understanding exactly how far they could push before drawing attention. Each death became a learning opportunity, each process methodical and deliberate, almost like a scientific experiment, but with human lives at its center. By late 1960, it was no longer a question of if they would strike again, but when. Their first kill had taught them the mechanics of evasion and the limits of local oversight. The pair communicated constantly about strategy, timing, and the logistics of moving a body through a system designed to trust them. Marlene handled the paperwork, insurance claims, and cremation schedules, while Everett focused on medication, timing, and the physical act of ensuring the death appeared natural. Together, they had created a cycle in which crime and routine were indistinguishable, and that first murder set the template. What is remarkable is that, at this stage, Everett and Marlene had no public suspicion, no tip-offs, and no overt violence. The town had accepted the death as mundane, natural, inevitable. But underneath the surface, a pattern was forming, one that would eventually draw attention years later, when a river revealed what had been hidden. Their first kill was the key. It taught them not only how easy it could be to remove a person without detection, but also how powerful it felt to orchestrate death with absolute precision. And yet, even as they celebrated their success privately, there was a subtle tension between them. Everett, shaped by war and medical discipline, approached each act clinically, methodically, like following a procedure in a hospital. Marlene, more pragmatic and business-minded, viewed each death in terms of risk, profit, and logistics. Together, they formed a system that balanced emotionless execution with careful planning, a partnership that made them more dangerous than either could have been alone. It was a combination of knowledge, trust, and meticulous preparation that made Walter Briggs's death not just a murder, but a turning point, a blueprint, and a silent warning to everyone who might cross their path in Garden City. By the time Walter's cremation was complete, the couple returned to their home, leaving behind no sign of foul play, no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no suspicion. That evening, they sat quietly over dinner, the ledger of Walter Briggs resting between them, the first in a growing collection that would mark the beginning of a sequence of calculated killings, each one designed to blend seamlessly into the rhythms of small-town life. This first kill had not only proven their method, it had demonstrated the terrifying possibility that life, trust, and routine could be manipulated completely by two people who appeared, on the surface, entirely ordinary. From that moment on, Everett and Marlene Calderón were no longer just ordinary residents of Garden City. They had become something much darker, their meticulous planning, access, and cold calculation laying the foundation for a series of murders that would remain invisible until the river, years later, began to reveal what had been hidden, piece by piece, to the shock of an entire community. After the first successful kill, Everett and Marlene Calderón didn't rush into the next one. Instead, they did what made them truly dangerous. They analyzed everything. They reviewed what worked, what felt risky, what could be optimized, and how close they had come to exposure, even though, on paper, they hadn't come close at all. This wasn't about impulse anymore. It was about building a system that could operate quietly, efficiently, and repeatedly without attracting attention. They understood something crucial about small towns like Garden City. Law enforcement resources were limited, medical oversight was minimal, and people trusted official paperwork more than they trusted their instincts. If a death certificate said natural causes, most families accepted it. If a body was cremated quickly, there was no physical evidence left to question later. Everett and Marlene realized they weren't just exploiting individuals, they were exploiting the structure itself. By early 1960, they selected their second victim, a seasonal agricultural worker named Raymond Porter, who lived in temporary housing near the edge of town. He had arrived months earlier for harvest season and planned to leave once the work dried up. Nobody in Garden City knew him well, and nobody would notice if he never boarded the bus out of town. Everett approached him under the excuse of providing free medical help through a local veterans outreach initiative that didn't actually exist, using professional language and calm authority to build immediate trust. This time, Everett used a different method. Instead of medication mixed with alcohol, he manipulated carbon monoxide exposure by tampering with a small portable heater in Raymond's room. When Raymond was found dead the next morning, it was ruled an accidental gas inhalation caused by faulty equipment. Again, there was no autopsy. Again, the body passed through Dry Hollow Memorial. Again, the furnace erased the evidence. Marlene updated the private ledger, now adding patterns and notes, marking methods used and response times from authorities. She treated it like business data, tracking efficiency and risk. What started as a single act had now become a repeatable operation. The third kill came later that year, and this one pushed their confidence even further. The victim was Harold Finley, a retired widower who lived alone in a small house near the rail yard. He received a modest pension and had no surviving children. Everett visited him under the pretense of checking on blood pressure and heart health, offering free medical advice to help seniors stay independent. This time, the method involved a slow-acting medication overdose that caused cardiac failure over several hours, leaving no obvious external symptoms. Harold died quietly in his bed, and once again the cause of death was listed as heart failure related to age. The pattern repeated itself with terrifying consistency. No investigation, no follow-up, no suspicion. For Everett and Marlene, this confirmed what they had already suspected, which was that the town system trusted them more than it questioned unexplained death. With each successful kill, something else changed as well. They stopped seeing victims as people and started seeing them as categories. Isolated, mobile, unconnected, disposable. Their conversations shifted from moral hesitation to logistical efficiency, discussing timing, paperwork flow, cremation schedules, and furnace maintenance as casually as other couples discussed grocery lists. Inside their home, Marlene expanded the private archive. She organized stolen personal items into labeled boxes, each associated with a ledger entry. Wallets, watches, rings, driver's licenses, personal letters, and photographs were all stored systematically. This collection wasn't about profit. It was about control, proof, and identity. Each item represented a person they had erased while still keeping a piece of them locked away. By 1961, Everett and Marlene had perfected their routine. Everett handled physical execution and medical manipulation, while Marlene controlled the administrative side, ensuring deaths moved smoothly through official channels. Together, they operated like a quiet production line, invisible to the public and protected by the very institutions designed to manage death respectfully. But as their confidence grew, so did their ambition. They began taking greater risks by expanding their victim pool and experimenting with more complex scenarios. One case involved staging a food poisoning incident at a boarding house, where a single occupant was targeted without affecting others. Another involved manipulating prescription refills to create the appearance of accidental overdose. Each success reinforced their belief that they were smarter than the system and untouchable. However, every system built on deception eventually creates pressure points. In late 1962, Marlene noticed something troubling while reviewing internal records. The frequency of cremations linked to certain neighborhoods and social groups was increasing in ways that could eventually raise questions. Even though no one had noticed yet, patterns were forming in the data, and patterns are dangerous when enough eyes start looking. At the same time, Everett began showing signs of emotional detachment that went beyond professional coldness. He slept less, became more rigid in routine, and started revisiting the furnace room alone late at night, standing in front of the chamber longer than necessary. What once felt like control was slowly becoming obsession, and Marlene could sense that something in him was shifting. Still, they continued. By the end of 1963, their private ledger contained multiple names, each one carefully documented and erased from public memory. They believed they had mastered the process completely, unaware that their growing operation was building a trail not in blood or fingerprints, but in data, habits, and subtle inconsistencies that would eventually catch the attention of someone trained to look beyond surface explanations. Most importantly, they did not realize that one of their future victims would not disappear quietly. That person would leave behind a written trail, a personal record that could not be burned in a furnace, and that single mistake would begin unraveling everything they had built. For now, though, Everett and Marlene Calderón continued operating in the shadows, refining their system, expanding their archive, and treating death not as tragedy, but as a controllable process, confident that Garden City would never suspect the couple responsible for handling the town's dead were the same people creating them. By the early months of 1964, Everett and Marlene Calderón had built a system of death so precise, so quiet, that it was nearly invisible to anyone outside Dry Hollow Memorial. Yet, as is often the case in small towns, patterns have a way of revealing themselves, even when nobody wants to see. A few subtle anomalies began to surface in Garden City. Whispers among neighbors, small inconsistencies in death records, and the occasional uneasy comment from local doctors who noticed the odd timing of sudden heart failures among isolated residents. None of these things were dramatic enough to trigger alarm, but to a trained observer, they were the first hints that something was profoundly wrong. Detective Alan Brewer, a 42-year-old investigator with the Kansas State Bureau of Investigation, was transferred to Garden City in the spring of 1964. Brewer was no stranger to small-town dynamics. He had grown up in rural Kansas and understood the way people trusted appearances over facts. When he first arrived, his superiors warned him that violent crime in Garden City was minimal and that most of his time would be spent on property disputes, traffic accidents, and local disturbances. But Brewer had a reputation for noticing patterns others missed, and it didn't take long before he noticed the first subtle thread connecting a series of unexplained deaths. Brewer's first observation came from death certificates. Over the previous 5 years, several elderly men and isolated residents had died under suspiciously similar circumstances. Each death attributed to heart failure, each body processed quickly through Dry Hollow Memorial, each cremation following a remarkably consistent timeline. On paper, nothing warranted concern, yet Brewer's instinct told him that someone was manipulating the system. Something about the uniformity, the timing, and the way families seemed to accept sudden deaths without question suggested a deeper pattern. Over the next few months, Brewer dug deeper. He cross-referenced coroner reports, cremation logs, and insurance documents. Slowly, a map of disappearances began to emerge, a network of victims who were socially invisible, medically unmonitored, and funneled quietly through the funeral home. While he could not yet prove wrongdoing, the consistency of the data was enough to raise a red flag in his mind. The pattern was almost too neat, almost mechanical, yet it was carried out with such precision that no single act seemed criminal on its own. Meanwhile, Everett and Marlene continued their operations without hesitation. They remained careful, varying methods and spacing out victims, believing that their careful planning had eliminated all risk. To them, Detective Brewer was just another small-town policeman, someone who would eventually focus on the occasional traffic violation or petty theft, rather than noticing the meticulous architecture of death they had built. Yet, unbeknownst to them, Brewer was connecting dots that nobody else had considered, looking for anomalies in timing, records, and cremation schedules that hinted at a deliberate pattern. The first small crack in the couple's invisible armor appeared when Brewer began asking subtle questions at Dry Hollow Memorial. He inquired about the frequency of cremations, the timing of death certificates, and the medical background of certain decedents. Everett answered politely, providing precise explanations that sounded perfectly reasonable, while Marlene logged his questions meticulously, assessing risk and adjusting future operations accordingly. They treated Brewer as a minor nuisance, assuming their procedural rigor would be enough to deflect suspicion, but the seed of concern had been planted. By late 1964, Brewer's investigation had moved from pattern recognition to more active surveillance. He interviewed local medical staff, cross-checked hospital and pharmacy records, and began quietly observing the funeral home's operations without alerting Everett and Marlene. Though he lacked concrete proof of murder, he recognized that the coincidences were too consistent to ignore, and began to develop a strategy for uncovering whether these deaths were truly accidental or intentionally orchestrated. Every unanswered question, every anomaly in paperwork, and every death that seemed suspicious in its predictability strengthened his resolve. At the same time, Everett and Marlene began feeling subtle pressure. They noticed Brewer's occasional presence near the funeral home, brief conversations with staff who mentioned his inquiries, and the way his questions sometimes lingered on the details of cremation logs or unusual deaths. While Everett remained focused on procedural perfection and Marlene concentrated on documentation and risk mitigation, both understood that an attentive investigator like Brewer could one day threaten their carefully built system. Yet for now, he was only an observer, and the Calderons maintained their confidence that their methods were sound and that small-town trust would protect them from scrutiny. In early 1965, Brewer took the next logical step, examining unclaimed property records and cross-referencing items from deceased residents that should have passed through the funeral home. He began noticing small irregularities in the processing of personal effects and inconsistencies in cremation schedules that hinted at deliberate manipulation. While still insufficient for a criminal charge, the pattern reinforced his suspicion that Garden City had an invisible predator operating under the guise of normalcy. He started documenting everything, creating a personal archive of potential leads and anomalies that could one day form the foundation of a formal investigation. By mid-1965, the tension between the Calderón's confidence and the investigators' scrutiny began to escalate. Though neither side fully understood the stakes, Everett and Marlene continued selecting victims and perfecting methods, experimenting with new techniques and ensuring that each death remained invisible to the outside world. Meanwhile, Brewer methodically compiled records, interviewed anyone who could offer insight, and began creating the first comprehensive profile of the person or people responsible. He had no name yet, no physical description, and no idea of the methods employed, but he was building a framework that would one day catch them. For viewers trying to understand this moment, it is important to recognize that this is where the story truly begins to turn. Up until now, the Calderóns operated with near total impunity, mastering a system of death that leveraged trust, bureaucracy, and societal neglect. But the emergence of a determined investigator like Alan Brewer introduced an unseen counterforce, someone willing to dig beneath appearances, question convenient explanations, and connect seemingly unrelated events. This tension, the invisible predator versus the meticulous investigator, is what would eventually escalate, setting the stage for mistakes, exposure, and the unraveling of a meticulously constructed system of murder. By late 1965, Brewer's work remained largely invisible to the Calderóns, but the first seeds of pressure had been planted. The systematic nature of the deaths, the unusual patterns in cremation and record-keeping, and the unexpected attention of a persistent detective created a latent threat that would begin to weigh on the couple's operations. For the first time, the illusion of invincibility began to crack, even if Everett and Marlene didn't yet realize it. In a small town like Garden City, attention was rare and scrutiny was dangerous, and the presence of a vigilant investigator would soon prove that even the most carefully constructed system of death can leave traces, patterns, and vulnerabilities that even the most methodical killers cannot anticipate. By mid-1966, Everett and Marlene Calderón had perfected their system, selecting victims who were isolated, invisible, and unlikely to draw attention. But even the most methodical killers make mistakes, and in their case, it began with a woman named Lillian Harper. Lillian was 42, a former school teacher who had moved to Garden City to live quietly after a difficult divorce. She rented a small house near the edge of town, lived alone, and seemed the perfect candidate in the eyes of the Calderóns. Unlike previous victims, however, she was organized, cautious, and kept personal records that she thought of as mundane, but which would later become key evidence against her killers. Everett first approached Lillian under the pretense of providing medical advice for stress-related insomnia, claiming he had new methods to improve sleep naturally. He was careful, polite, and methodical, as always, making her feel that she was receiving professional guidance rather than interacting with a stranger. Marlene coordinated from the background, reviewing timing, cremation schedules, and procedural details to ensure that the operation would run smoothly. The plan was simple. Everett would administer a slow-acting dose of medication that would mimic natural causes, leaving the body unremarkable and the death untraceable. But Lillian was not like their other victims. She kept detailed journals, wrote letters to friends regularly, and recorded her health and routines meticulously. She also had one particular habit. She maintained a small binder of her prescriptions, health notes, and doctor visits, believing it might be useful in case of any future health problems. The Calderóns did not know about this binder. It was a tiny oversight, seemingly insignificant at the time, but it would become the single thread that unraveled years of careful planning. Everett administered the medication, and within hours, Lillian collapsed in her home. She was found by a neighbor the following morning. The official cause of death, as expected, was listed as cardiac arrest related to stress and age, and her body was transported to Dry Hollow Memorial for cremation. To the outside world, it was a quiet, ordinary death. No alarm was raised, no police questioned the circumstances, and the Calderóns assumed their system remained flawless. However, when Marlene processed the paperwork, she noticed something odd. A prescription labeled with unusual dosages, handwritten by Lillian herself in her meticulous script. It was the only item that didn't fit neatly into their ledger. Marlene dismissed it initially, but Everett, in his growing obsession with control and precision, decided to keep a copy, believing it might serve future reference. Unbeknownst to them, this binder, which Everett secretly photographed for internal tracking, contained the exact timeline, doses, and symptoms leading up to her death, proof that would later contradict the official narrative and form the core of the investigation against them. It didn't end there. Lillian's journal had been mailed to a distant friend shortly before her death, documenting her health concerns and interactions with Everett. The letters described her trust in him, her questions about the medication, and her notes on subtle effects she felt after his visits. These documents survived because they were outside of the Calderón's control, and they would later provide investigators with a unique first-hand account linking the couple directly to her death. Meanwhile, Detective Alan Brewer had begun compiling the inconsistencies he noticed in previous deaths. Lillian Harper's case, though seemingly ordinary at first, triggered a new layer of suspicion. Brewer noticed that her death matched the patterns he had identified earlier: sudden, isolated, medically unexplained, and routed through Dry Hollow Memorial with unusual efficiency. Unlike earlier victims, though, her personal records left traces that could be verified independently of death certificates, which finally gave Brewer a tangible connection between the victims and someone within the funeral home. The Calderons, confident in their invincibility, failed to recognize the significance of these surviving documents. Everett was proud of their efficiency, and Marlene continued to treat each death as a logistical operation. Neither considered that an overlooked journal or an unusual prescription could expose them. They underestimated the persistence of someone trained to see patterns, where others saw coincidences. As Brewer began following the paper trail, he discovered that Lillian's prescriptions and personal notes did not align with the timeline presented in her death certificate. The medications she recorded were inconsistent with the cause of death listed officially, creating discrepancies that could be traced back to someone who had direct access to her body and her records. This gap, though small, was enough to warrant further investigation, and it marked the first step in connecting the deaths to Everett and Marlene Calderón. In essence, Lillian Harper became the turning point. She was the first victim whose surviving documentation, combined with Brewer's meticulous record review, would pierce the illusion of safety the Calderons had built around themselves. Her careful attention to detail, the notes she maintained, and her proactive communication with friends outside Garden City created a digital and physical footprint that Everett and Marlene could not erase, even with their knowledge of cremation, paperwork manipulation, and system exploitation. By late 1966, the investigation had quietly escalated. Brewer was no longer just observing patterns, he was assembling a case. He collected Lillian's binder, her letters, and her prescription records, comparing them to funeral home logs and death certificates. Slowly, the first pieces of evidence that could stand in court were emerging, not from police intuition or eyewitness accounts, but from the meticulous habits of a woman who had been underestimated by her killers. Meanwhile, the Calderons continued their operations, unaware that a single oversight, an organized victim who left records, was beginning to unravel the entire system. They selected their next targets with the same careful calculation, yet the presence of Detective Brewer's quiet scrutiny meant that the margin for error was shrinking. Every future decision would now carry more risk, and even their methodical approach could no longer guarantee invisibility. Lillian Harper's case demonstrated a universal truth. No system, no matter how precise, is flawless. When human habits, meticulous records, or unexpected diligence intersect with murder, they can create cracks in even the most disciplined operation. For Everett and Marlene Calderón, that crack had now appeared, and the next several years would test their ability to maintain control as law enforcement began to close in. By 1967, Everett and Marlene Calderón were no longer operating in total invisibility, though they didn't realize it yet. The first cracks in their perfect system, caused by Lillian Harper's meticulous records, had begun to attract the attention of Detective Alan Brewer, who had quietly been assembling evidence over the past year. Brewer had noticed patterns that connected the deaths of isolated Garden City residents, each routed through Dry Hollow Memorial with unusual efficiency, and Lillian's journal and prescriptions provided the first concrete link between the victims and someone with direct access to them. From this point forward, the Calderons' carefully orchestrated operations began to experience pressure, unlike anything they had previously faced. The first sign that trouble was approaching came not from law enforcement directly, but from small, persistent anomalies. Funeral home staff began to notice Brewer's presence more frequently, asking pointed questions about cremation schedules, unusual influxes of bodies, and discrepancies in paperwork. Marlene, who managed these records meticulously, initially treated his inquiries as minor nuisances, adjusting documentation to cover any gaps. Everett, meanwhile, had begun to sense a subtle tension, a feeling that someone was observing him more closely than anyone had before. He tightened routines, double-checked medication records, and began running small tests to ensure that all future deaths could be traced only through the official channels they controlled. Brewer's investigation, however, had grown beyond simple observation. Using Lillian Harper's binder and letters, he began cross-referencing other deaths that had followed a similar pattern. Each time a victim's records didn't perfectly match official documentation, Brewer added it to a growing database, identifying correlations that were invisible to anyone outside law enforcement. He started creating victim profiles, noting age, medical history, social connections, and circumstances of death. What emerged was a map of vulnerability. Older, isolated, socially invisible individuals, whose deaths could be manipulated without raising suspicion. The Calderons, in their hubris, continued their operations, unaware that this map was being constructed. Their confidence remained high because nothing in public view had changed. Families continued to accept deaths as natural. Cremations were processed without delay, and the furnace erased the physical evidence that might have raised questions. Yet every time a victim was selected and processed, Brewer's invisible network of records grew stronger, filling in gaps, confirming patterns, and narrowing the circle of suspects. Pressure increased further when a local pharmacist noticed unusual prescription patterns linked to Everett's visits. This pharmacist, while unaware of the broader scheme, mentioned the anomalies to Brewer, providing additional data that reinforced the detective's suspicions. Now, Brewer had not only documentation from victims, but also corroborating testimony from a professional witness who had observed deviations in medication and dosage histories. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, slowly but with undeniable clarity. Everett, always confident in his control, remained unaware of the depth of Brewer's scrutiny. He and Marlene continued selecting victims, sometimes experimenting with slightly altered methods, believing that variation would prevent detection. They were wrong. Brewer's database accounted for timing, method, and even the demographics of each victim. What they considered minor adjustments were, in his analysis, consistent with the larger pattern, reinforcing the idea that someone within Dry Hollow Memorial was systematically orchestrating deaths. By late 1967, Brewer had begun coordinating with state investigators to examine Dry Hollow Memorial more closely. While they could not yet prove homicide, they were allowed to perform limited audits, reviewing cremation schedules, death certificates, and insurance documentation. These audits revealed subtle anomalies, mismatches between recorded causes of death, unusually fast cremations, and gaps in the documentation of personal effects. Each anomaly was minor on its own, but collectively, they suggested intentional manipulation and possibly criminal activity. The Calderons, confident in their system, had unknowingly laid the groundwork for scrutiny that would eventually lead to their undoing. In their home, tension began to creep in as well. Marlene noticed the subtle changes in Everett. He was more rigid, more obsessive, and increasingly insistent on double-checking every detail of every death. Their conversations, once strictly procedural, now included whispered warnings about possible scrutiny, concerns over unusual inquiries, and plans to adjust paperwork if necessary. They had begun to feel, for the first time, that control might not be absolute. Yet they continued their work, selecting new victims and following their meticulous protocols, confident that their experience and knowledge gave them an advantage no investigator could match. Even as the Calderons maintained outward normalcy, the invisible pressure from law enforcement and the careful accumulation of evidence created an underlying tension that would soon manifest in mistakes. Every visit, every cremation, every ledger entry became a potential risk. The couple's usual confidence now carried the weight of awareness that someone was watching, tracking, and analyzing their operations. For the first time, the illusion of invulnerability began to crack, and every action had to be weighed against the growing possibility of exposure. This period of mounting pressure was critical. It marked the transition from operational mastery to vulnerability. Everett and Marlene were still highly efficient killers, and their methods remained sophisticated, but the environment around them had changed. Detective Brewer's persistent investigation, the unusual prescription patterns, and the meticulous documentation left by victims like Lillian Harper meant that one misstep could unravel years of careful planning. The Calderons had underestimated the combination of diligence, persistence, and analytical skill that would soon bring the first tangible threats to their operation. By the end of 1967, Everett and Marlene Calderón were operating under stress they could neither quantify nor fully understand. Their routines continued. Their victims continued to die under carefully orchestrated conditions, and yet a web of observation, records, and suspicion had begun to encircle them. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted, and the invisible detective watching every move was beginning to turn patterns into proof, theory into evidence, and suspicion into the foundation of a case that would ultimately expose one of the most meticulous serial killing operations in Garden City history. By the spring of 1967, Detective Alan Brewer had quietly amassed a mountain of circumstantial evidence against Everett and Marlene Calderón, though nothing yet could convict them outright. He had records, inconsistencies in death certificates, the surviving binder from Lillian Harper, and letters confirming the timeline of her last days. But what he needed now were physical traces, tangible proof that linked a person or persons directly to the repeated unnatural deaths in Garden City. Brewer's breakthrough came unexpectedly. During routine checks of Dry Hollow Memorial's inventory, he noticed a discrepancy in the storage of personal items from unclaimed bodies. Some small valuables, including watches and jewelry, were cataloged in a way that didn't match the official ledger. He couldn't yet prove they belonged to deceased residents, but it was enough to secure a search warrant. The moment he stepped into the funeral home, he felt the weight of a place that had been hiding secrets for years. Everett and Marlene, meticulous as ever, noticed nothing unusual at first. They continued their daily routines, running the cremation furnace, processing paperwork, and selecting their next victims with the same care and precision that had protected them for nearly a decade. Every movement was calculated, every detail recorded in private ledgers, every potential oversight accounted for. They had built a system so tightly controlled that even the increasing scrutiny from the State Bureau didn't rattle them. But the search revealed something they had not entirely anticipated: a small collection of personal items from earlier victims, neatly stored but tagged in ways that connected them to specific cremations. Nothing incriminating by itself, yet enough to raise questions, and Brewer's instincts recognized patterns immediately. Fingerprints on old ledgers, traces of handwriting that matched cremation logs, and a selection of small personal effects suggested that someone with access to the funeral home had been handling these deaths in ways inconsistent with normal procedure. Everett and Marlene reacted with their characteristic calm calculation. They didn't panic. They didn't flee. Instead, they began meticulously reviewing every record, cross-checking every ledger entry, and preparing explanations that could withstand scrutiny. Everett rehearsed his statements for investigators, ensuring that any anomalies could be attributed to clerical error or procedural irregularities. Marlene, with her unmatched attention to paperwork, organized every log to appear flawless. They were not reckless killers, they were strategic, thinking several steps ahead, using the same cold logic that had enabled them to evade suspicion for years. Meanwhile, Brewer continued piecing together patterns across multiple deaths. He discovered that certain victims' cremations had been accelerated, sometimes on the very day of death, and that certain families had been unusually compliant in waiving viewing and autopsy requests. By cross-referencing these behaviors with personal property records, he began to see the invisible lines connecting the deaths to a central operator. While he had yet to capture direct evidence linking the Calderons to the administration of lethal substances, the circumstantial weight of the investigation was growing heavier with every detail. The Calderons, aware that someone was beginning to watch them more closely, adjusted their operations subtly. They spaced out victims more carefully, varied methods, and avoided patterns that could be detected too easily. They had no intention of stopping. The system they had built was too efficient, too profitable, and too satisfying to abandon. Yet the presence of Detective Brewer added pressure, forcing them to operate with an intensity and discipline that even they had never had to maintain before. By the end of 1967, Brewer had finally identified a small set of victims whose deaths could not be fully explained without considering foul play. These cases, combined with the recovered ledger entries and personal items, created the first real foundation for an investigation that could withstand scrutiny in court. But Brewer also understood the danger of acting too soon. The Calderons were careful, patient, and methodical. A premature confrontation could allow them to eliminate evidence or manipulate new records to obscure the pattern further. Inside their home, Everett and Marlene continued their meticulous routines, completely aware of the scrutiny they faced, but unshaken in their confidence. They had always been thorough, and now that pressure existed, they became even more precise, almost mechanical in their execution. Nothing was left to chance. Every interaction, every transaction, every cremation was reviewed and logged. The Calderons were aware of the looming threat, but remained unafraid, confident that their combination of discipline, control, and foresight would keep them untouchable. And yet, in the quiet moments after closing the funeral home each night, there was a tension that even the most controlled calculations could not eliminate. Everett reviewed his doses and logs. Marlene double-checked her ledgers and archives. They had survived scrutiny for years, and they understood that any misstep could bring everything crashing down. But they did not fear the law. They feared exposure only as a threat to the system they had perfected. They were still in complete control, operating with chilling calm and efficiency, fully aware that every action mattered, and that Detective Brewer was observing, calculating, connecting, but still had no direct proof against them. In essence, Part 7 closes on a quiet but growing tension. The Calderons were still the architects of their own invisible empire of death, operating with unmatched precision. Detective Brewer had assembled the beginnings of a case, gathering the first tangible traces that would eventually tie them together. The trap was set, but the Calderons were aware, methodical, and unshaken. The next move would come from the combination of their past actions and the persistence of law enforcement. A collision that was inevitable, yet still fully within the logical chain of cause and effect. By early 1968, Detective Alan Brewer had built an ironclad timeline of the Calderons' actions, a web of evidence that connected Dry Hollow Memorial to a series of suspicious deaths spanning nearly a decade. It was no longer just pattern recognition, it was concrete documentation. Ledgers listing personal items removed from bodies, the photographic copy of Lillian Harper's binder detailing her prescriptions, cremation schedules manipulated to avoid scrutiny, and testimony from families who had noticed inconsistencies in the handling of their loved ones' remains. The pieces fit together like a map, leading directly to Everett and Marlene, and Brewer knew the moment to act had arrived. The arrest plan was precise. Acting quietly in the pre-dawn hours to prevent any destruction of evidence, state investigators and local police moved simultaneously on both the Calderon residence and Dry Hollow Memorial. Everett and Marlene were taken by surprise, not because they were careless, but because they had never faced someone who could see through every step of their meticulously crafted system. For years, they had operated with chilling control, carefully spacing victims, varying methods, and exploiting societal blind spots. Now, every decision, every death, every ledger entry, and every stolen item became undeniable proof in the hands of law enforcement. During the initial search of the funeral home, investigators discovered the most damning evidence: a meticulously organized archive of personal effects from over a dozen victims, including watches, wallets, letters, photographs, and other personal documents that had been removed from the deceased before cremation. Each item was tagged with a ledger entry that corresponded to a name, date, and supposed cause of death, effectively cataloging the Calderón's crimes. Lillian Harper's preserved binder, combined with letters she had sent to friends outside Garden City, provided direct links to Everett's administration of medication, creating a bridge between circumstantial patterns and concrete evidence. The couple remained composed during questioning, Everett speaking with calculated calm and Marlene answering carefully, their confidence rooted in years of operating a flawless system. But each question revealed more inconsistencies, and the weight of multiple lines of evidence, physical, documentary, and testimonial, soon became inescapable. By the end of the week, the Calderons were formally charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and tampering with remains. The trial became the most sensational criminal case in Garden City's history. Prosecutors presented a combination of documentary evidence and witness testimony, illustrating how the Calderons had exploited the town's trust and the funeral home system to commit systematic, premeditated murders over nearly a decade. Everett and Marlene's meticulous records, previously a source of pride, were now the strongest evidence against them. Photographs of personal effects, copies of Lillian Harper's binder, and comparative analysis of death certificates and cremation schedules created an irrefutable chain linking the couple to each crime. During the trial, Everett's demeanor remained composed, his military precision evident in every response, while Marlene's analytical calm betrayed no fear. Yet even their poise could not counterbalance the sheer weight of evidence. Families of victims testified, describing unexplained absences, missing possessions, and inconsistencies in official documentation. Experts testified on pharmacology, highlighting the precise ways Everett had administered lethal doses, and forensic analysts detailed how cremation logs and ledger entries demonstrated premeditation. The jury was presented with an overwhelming and meticulously documented case, leaving little room for doubt. After months of proceedings, deliberations concluded with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge, acknowledging the gravity and scale of the Calderons' crimes, sentenced both Everett and Marlene Calderón to death. Appeals were attempted, but the combination of documentary evidence, personal records, and eyewitness accounts created an airtight case. In 1970, the sentence was carried out at the Kansas State Penitentiary. Everett Calderón faced the execution with the same composure he had shown throughout his life. Marlene, likewise, met her fate with calm calculation, reflecting a lifetime of cold precision that had allowed them to operate undetected for years. The state's lethal injection chamber became the final stage of a system they had built with meticulous care for creating death, now repurposed to deliver justice. The aftermath left Garden City reeling, struggling to comprehend how a married couple running the town's funeral home could have committed such crimes over nearly a decade. Detective Brewer's diligence and refusal to ignore patterns had ensured that justice was served, demonstrating that even the most meticulous and disciplined criminals can be caught when persistent observation, methodical evidence collection, and logical analysis converge. The story of Everett and Marlene Calderón remains a chilling reminder of how ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary evil, how trust can be weaponized, and how meticulous planning can be both a tool for crime and ultimately a roadmap for justice. Every ledger, every stolen item, every careful note that once allowed them to operate with impunity became the instruments of their exposure, cementing a case that remains a benchmark for investigative rigor in small-town America.